This week's blog post is the first in a new series called Sculpture Synopsis. This one is on Egyptian art. This series of 12 posts is a quick overview of the major periods in Western art. It will focus almost exclusively on life-size or over-life-size sculptures. Each post will have one important work as an illustration, one memorable work, and it will include a date with a timeline, a location with a map, the most common media, the most common subjects, the dominant ideas in art with a note on contemporary philosophy, comments on style, major innovations that occur during this period, famous artists, a few other important works, where to see the original works of this period, and suggestions for further reading. So why am I doing this synopsis? Back in 2003, when I'd been on a couple cruises to Europe, I was surprised to realize that many of the people who went on excursions had no framework for appreciating the splendid artworks they were paying to see. In fact, they had no reason for visiting any artworks other than, it's Tuesday, I'm in Paris, have to take the Louvre tour. So I put together a 6-hour course with slides on highlights of Western sculpture and painting, which I called the Crash Cruise Course. These posts, the Sculpture Synopsis posts, are based on the sort of cheat sheets that I made as a supplement to the Crash Cruise Course. If you want to become familiar with major art historical periods, this series of posts is a good place to start. Eventually I changed my focus from surveying major artworks to searching out major innovations, and that resulted in the Two Innovators books, which is a good place to start if you want a sweeping overview of the progress of art, rather than just the major periods. So here we go on Egyptian. This is the example, the most memorable example that I could find. It's Mycerinus and his queen, dates to around 2490 to 2472 BC. Let me talk for a minute about the dates of Egyptian sculpture. Major works, life-size works, in Egyptian sculpture begin at about 3100 BC. As a recognizable style, ancient Egyptian art continues under the rule of assorted foreigners sometimes until at least the 1st century BC. We know generally the order in which Egyptian pharaohs ruled, but because ancient Egypt was so isolated during most of its history, it's difficult to figure out how the pharaohs' reigns correspond to events outside Egypt. I mean, if they'd been having wars with other people, the other people have written histories, we would know the dates, but we don't. Dates for major periods can vary by as much as a century from one source to another. These dates that I'm using are from the Encyclopedia Britannica. I've included the dynasties in parentheses because there are some art histories that will date works by dynasty rather than giving you a year. Alright, so that's the dates. Location. The core of ancient Egypt was a 10-mile wide strip of cultivated agricultural land along 600 miles of the Nile River, running from the Mediterranean south to Luxor. The media of Egyptian sculpture is granite and limestone in shades of gray, black, and beige, and sometimes they even use flecked granite. The subjects are portraits of pharaohs and high officials, and gods with animal heads. They are done for tombs and temples. Common people only appear in very small-scale sculptures. Sculptures are placed inside temples where only priests and high officials can see them, or inside tombs where no one sees them after the tomb is sealed. The continuity in Egyptian style comes not because sculptors are seeing the work of their predecessors and contemporaries, but because a rigid set of conventions is followed, which I'll discuss in a moment under style. Dominant ideas. First, only the gods in the highest level of society, the pharaoh, the priests, the officials, are important. The afterlife is more important than this life. Change is not desirable. Under the heading of philosophical notes, for the Egyptians, religion is the explanation for everything. Moving on to style. Egyptian art uses a rigid set of conventions. It's immediately recognizable. The hair is stiff like a wig. All the faces have similar shapes and features. The proportions of the bodies are set by a grid that's drawn on the block before carving begins. All the figures have the same proportions. The arms are held stiffly at the sides and attached to the torso. For men, the left foot is forward, always the left foot. The weight is on the back foot, the right foot, and both feet are flat on the ground. Women's feet are generally side by side, although occasionally they too will have the left foot forward. Large-scale stone sculpture is never freestanding. The stone is left between the legs and the spine is attached to a support. The figures are carved in separately from the four sides of the block and tend to have a cubic look. And finally, men always wear a kilt and women always wear a tight-fitting dress. What are the innovations in this period? The major innovations in the sense that I talk about in Innovators in Sculpture. This is the period when life-size sculptures of human beings first appear. Previously, sculptures had been the size that you can hold in your hand, or not much larger. The sculpture in the lower right is about 4 inches. Big names in art. None are known. The sculptors were servants or slaves of the pharaoh. They were craftsmen whose names were not considered worth recording. A couple other important examples. We have the Great Sphinx at Giza from about 2500 BC. The next one is the head of Nefertiti, more than 1,000 years later. We have the Mask of King Tut, around 1340, soon after Nefertiti, and the Temple of Ramses II at Abu Simbel, circa 1264 BC. And what I want you to notice here is the colossal scale. Where do you go to see the original Egyptian sculptures? In the blog post, I've given you links to the Egyptian art sections in these museums. The Egyptian Museum in Cairo probably has the most. The British Museum, the Louvre, the Metropolitan Museum, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston also have significant collections, partly because it was excavators from Britain, France, and the US who worked on many of the archaeological sites in Egypt in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And the Vatican Museums also has some Egyptian art. For further reading, you could see Innovators in Sculpture, Chapter 1, with many more illustrations. I've given you a link to a list of books on ancient Egypt by an Egyptologist who probably has more sense of what's important than I do. And just for fun, there's a series of murder mysteries involving Amelia Peabody. The main characters are archaeologists excavating in Egypt during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. There are 20 books in all, and the first of them is Crocodile and the Sandbank. That's it for this post. DianeDuranteWriter.com has hundreds of posts on sculpture, painting, architecture, and my other obsessions. To join the Sunday Recommendations email list, visit the URL that's on the screen or email me. And you can say, "Well done, Diane," or support my work and receive rewards by means of the tip jar on DianeDuranteWriter.com. As always, thank you for listening.